And welcome back to the OHIO podcast, everybody. I am Buckeye Boggs. That man over there is the wild man, Chris Wilds. And this is our Wisconsin Badgers 2023 preview. Chris, if there is one team that Ohio State's going to keep an eye on this season, it's going to be over there in Madison, Wisconsin, because Columbus's favorite son, former Ohio State head coach for one season, former Ohio State defensive coordinator, former head coach of the Cincinnati Bearcats down I-71 in Ohio,
And,
Luke
and, as,
Fickle is the head coach of the Wisconsin Badgers, my man.
and as one of our fans said on Sunday, Eric, is he the one that got away?
Oh man, I tell you, it makes you wonder what what the future's gonna hold if Luke Fickle does what you and I think he's capable of doing over in Madison and building a consistent not only winner there, but a consistent team that will be fighting for championships in the Big Ten and probably beyond as the college football playoff expands to 12 teams beginning next season. So let's take a look about how Wisconsin did last year and historically over the years, Chris. All right, let's start with the fact that last year they went 7-6 overall. Excuse me, they were 4-5 in the Big Ten. This is Fickle's first season there in Madison, Wisconsin. Camp Randall. Camp Randall is the home field with a capacity of 85,458. Wisconsin has an all-time record of 735 wins, 512 losses, 53 ties for a 586 winning percentage. A bowl record of 19-15. That is a really good bowl record. And 14 conference titles, all in the Big Ten. Last season was interesting, my man. Last year
It was.
they started with a different head coach than what they finished off with, but they started the season with a 38-0 win over Illinois and then dropped 17-14 to Washington State at home. And that kind of lets you know right away things were not well in Madison. They lost or they beat New Mexico State. Everybody beat New Mexico State last year. Then they got just pummeled on the road when they came to Columbus, 52-21. They dropped a just a dismantling, heartbreaking loss to Illinois, 34-10. As old Burt welcomed in his old team and just dismantled them. They beat Northwestern, which everybody beat Northwestern like a drum last year. And then this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. They lost in double overtime to Michigan State 34-28, and they were 3-4 on the season. They did have a little bit of a bounce back as the DC took over 35-24 win over Maryland, or excuse me, Purdue, a 23-10 win over Maryland. They lost 24-10 to Iowa. They won 15-14 by one over a hapless Nebraska team. Then they lost to rival Minnesota 23-16. 6-6 on the season was good enough to get them to a bowl game. Luke Fickle comes in, takes over, wins in his first game as head coach at Wisconsin in a bowl game 24-17. Last year, Vegas said this was a 9-win team. I said, "Yep, that's exactly what they are, 9-3." So I didn't bet anything on them. Chris, you said, I think they're 8-4. Take the under." You were right. At 6-6, they ended up being under the 9 wins, and you were on the money last year with that. Chris, Wisconsin was a kind of a very up and down season for them, but it offered the athletic department and the fan base clarification. We need to make a change. It told them that. And they were quick to pull the trigger mid-season. And because of that, I think they are sitting in a much better place today than they were a year ago at this point. Your thoughts?
Yeah, they're absolutely in a better place today than they were a year ago. Now, first of all, I want to correct you on something. You kind of slighted Washington State there a little bit, Eric. They are the pride of what's left of the Pac-12. So come on, let's give a little love to Washington State. No,
Sure.
this was a team that was just in disarray last year. Um, obviously, Ohio State. handed them a humiliating loss, that 52-21 loss in Columbus. And I'll tell you, Eric, you hear the phrase a lot of times, and the game wasn't that close. It truly wasn't. 14 of those points came very, very late in the game. Um, the Illinois loss hurt them. It, they did better, like you said, after the DC came on, took the reins a little bit, but they're in a better position this year at head coach by far. I think Luke Fickle is going to do tremendous things there. They're in better position at quarterback. I think what was it? Graham Mertz, I believe, was the
Skippy Mertz.
Skippy Mertz. Just was not the answer at quarterback. And I think the kid that transferred in from SMU is going to be a tremendous upgrade there.
Yeah.
Just across the board, this is a team that I think, and we're going to get into this in a little bit, I think is going to make a whole lot of noise this year.
Yeah, I'm with you. Actually, I agree with you. So, and welcome back to the OHIO podcast, everybody. As you can see, we are joined by our special guest here, Rich Brant. He's the co-host of the BuckAround Podcast. So we're gonna buck around and we're gonna find out about Wisconsin. That's what we're gonna do here.
You're the
Rich.
first person who's figured out the title of our show and what the little play on words is there. Very good, Eric.
Thank you very much. I was born at night, but not last night. So let's start right here, man. You guys' head coach is an alum. He is a loved Buckeye from Central Ohio, one who many of us thought would be the next head coach after Urban Meyer. That didn't happen. He goes from Cincinnati to Madison, Wisconsin, and I'll be honest with you, Ohio State fans have that game circled as we are fearful. Luke Fickle will have a chip on his shoulder. Wisconsin is a very good program, and there's a lot of buzz around the Big Ten from our perspective that Wisconsin has got the right man for the position, and the changes that he's going to make is something that a lot of us were always fearful of Wisconsin doing. We knew you could run the football. We knew you had a great offensive line. We knew you played good defense. The one thing we always kind of chuckled at was, would they ever be able to pass the football? And it looks like that's going to happen. What is the perspective from Badger faithful on Luke Fickle and that hire for you and your program?
To me personally, obviously it was very much a surprise. The conventional wisdom after Christ was fired, basically back-to-back won the Ohio State game where they just didn't even look like a Division I team, and then Illinois beating them was just the nail in the coffin. But the whole assumption for the rest of that interim period through the fall, kind of like Luke Fickle in 2011, ironically enough, is that Jim Leonard, the hometown kid, was going to be named the head coach. And when he wasn't, because it really was played very close to the vest, that all of a sudden it's Luke Fickle, sort of all of us were doing this. Well, I guess we have video, so I don't have to describe it like we do on our pod, but we were all looking around in shock in terms of people who watch Badger football, because they went out and hired arguably the most, I guess, on paper, it's the best hire, and I'm using air quotes there. Again, I'm forgetting you have video. I don't have to do that. But, it's him or Matt Rule or who were the A-list guys. I mean, on our show, we're saying if it's not Leonard, we were trying to talk people off the Lance Leipold ledge. Like, no. Let's not go running after a guy who goes at 6-7 at Kansas. I don't know if that's really like where Wisconsin should be looking, whether or not he was at Whitewater. I mean, we were talking ourselves into Dave Clawson on our podcast, like as an alternative. And to say I went from talking myself into Dave Clawson to, oh my gosh, they got Luke Fickle, you realize you had some Stockholm syndrome there. So I think the response overwhelmingly has been positive. There was definitely some initial maybe trepidation about a betrayal of Jim Leonard, but I think the reality is when you look at this, you can't argue with the hire. I mean, they hired a coach who was in the college football playoff, which the Badgers have not done. It was a major win. So I think the other part of that, which is something you touched on, I think the fan base was far more open to this because the other hometown son, Paul Christ, had been here, since 2015, and the entire identity of the team had been the defense, which he really doesn't have much to do with, and Jonathan Taylor. And beyond that, and they didn't really have any identity that you could say he shaped and molded. The offensive line was good. It's not as good as it has been. They're still putting guys in the league. There have been picks there, but not to the same, say level of maybe a decade ago. Really sort of tail end of Brett Bielema's tenure. Really, since then, there has been a little bit of a downslide. They've, again, had the good individuals, but maybe not the whole unit, top to bottom, left to right, 5 guys like they've had in the past. So I think overall, fan base is excited. The interesting thing is he is, as a coach, much more interested in a fan engagement in a way that Paul Chryst just never was. I mean, Paul Chryst was the coach who was just dying to sit in an office until 3:00 in the morning and watch film in a dark room with just a monitor on the wall, and he's just working the clicker. I mean, he is the proverbial, film guy, for lack of a better term, whereas Luke Fickell is much more engaged outwardly in terms of trying to build energy and excitement around his program. But to sort of ramble more through this answer, if you don't mind, I think really the big story about Wisconsin is not Luke Fickell. It's actually Chris McIntosh, who's the athletic director. I think the fact that Chris went outside the family, so to speak, is really the major story, because Barry Alvarez, not so much as coach, but as athletic director, really wanted the program turning inwards and looking for its coaches from within. And Paul Chryst was that guy. He brought in Gary Anderson for 2 years, and those two hated each other. And he kind of basically ran him out of town. He left for Oregon State, which is a bizarre coaching move, if you really think about it, going back a decade. And he brought in Paul Chryst. And Paul Chryst, after he came in, just kept bringing in Wisconsin guys. I mean, there was a point where the head coach, the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, the tight ends coach, if I'm getting the timing right, defensive line coach, and yeah, that's it. We're all Wisconsin alums. So 6 out of 10 guys were Wisconsin alums. So there was an idea of, you find our answers in-house, but I kind of think maybe that also leads to a little bit of inbreeding and maybe a lack of creative thinking. And they were able to get away with it on defense because, quite honestly, I mean, Jim Leonhard is like a generational coordinator. We don't know what he'll be in the future, but to this point in his career, he was really a remarkable coordinator in terms of the defenses he was putting together. But it was time for a change. And the fact that McIntosh, again, didn't pick Jim Leonhard and kept it so quiet, nobody knew that he was going outside. I mean, it was just totally under the radar and totally unknown. I mean, we had long established beat guys here putting out the word, it's Leonhard, it's Leonhard, it's Leonhard. This is going to be his contract. This is what it's going to be. And all of that turned out to be untrue.
Wow.
And when we found out about it hours before it was public. So it was a really bold move. We don't know if it'll work out, obviously, but the fact that Chris looked at this and said, Wisconsin needs to change. Wisconsin needs to modernize because the game really is changing and it needs to adapt to it is really a story to me through all of this.
So, it's funny. We used to call Paul Chryst vanilla ice cream. I mean,
yeah,
so plain. I mean, it's good, but it's plain. You got to add something to it. Is there a fear among Badger faithful that if Ryan Day were to exit or go to the NFL or continue to lose to that team up north, that Luke Fickell will get the phone call from Columbus, Ohio? Is that a real fear? Is that something that's being talked about, or is it hush hush? Don't even mention it.
Oh, no, I mean, that was the big knock about not taking Jim Leonhard. The whole concept was take Jim Leonhard because Jim's never going to leave. He turned down the Packers defensive coordinator job. He's turned down head coaching interviews. He turned down Alabama. Nick Saban came hunting for him, and he would have gotten a lot of money at Alabama, and he stayed at Madison. So the idea was, well, Jim wants to be here because Jim is going to stay here forever. This is the forever job for I forget how old Jim's about 40 years old. This is the forever job for him. Here's the guy for the next 15 years. And that was the knock against Luke Fickell. Well, as soon as you hire Luke Fickell, he's going to go to Ohio State. And I mean, the obvious answer is if you hire a coach and he gets hired away by anybody, whether it's Ohio State or any blue blood, like any program that's above Wisconsin in that pecking order, sort of that food chain of college football, that means he's doing really well. So why are you fearing that? If you have a coach who comes in, for him to get hired, he's got to be, to be successful at Wisconsin, the barometer is like 10-2, get to the Big Ten title game, and then maybe find a way to beat somebody from the East. Like that's really the next step for this program. And if he's consistently 10-2 and putting in the big title game, that's great. They haven't been doing that. They had 2019, and since 2019, they've been 13-11 against the Big Ten. That's terrible. That's not Wisconsin football. That's not what is expected of the program in terms of, to Badger. I mean, I think Badger fans are pretty aware of where they are in the food chain and saying, you're the best team in the West. I mean, this is the best program in the West, or should be, and it's not playing like it. So if a guy comes in and brings them back to that, that's great. That's a great problem to have. I think the only thing I think the Badgers have going for them in terms of that, in terms of that situation is there's only one team. I really do believe that. I mean, interestingly enough, the thing that I'm fascinated about is why Notre Dame and Luke Fickell never happened, because it's to me what made Wisconsin a yes, but Notre Dame a no. Now, maybe Notre Dame didn't show interest. I really don't know, but that is the great mystery and the great enigma to me, because I would never think of Wisconsin as a better job than Notre Dame. I really wouldn't. And it's interesting to me because they were, say 3 years ago, pretty toe to toe with Notre Dame on the recruiting trail, and to a point where I'd say the Badgers could get the guy 40% of the time. Whereas 5 years before that, if there was a guy Wisconsin offered and then Notre Dame offered, I just said, oh, well, let's just not think about that guy anymore because he's going to go to Notre Dame. But they got to themselves where they had a puncher's chance against Notre Dame, which I thought was pretty significant, but still thought of Notre Dame is Notre Dame, right? It's old leather helmets and black and white film. It's a different thing than Wisconsin, which basically has, a 30-year history in football.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Notre Dame's interesting because of the way that they are set up. I really think that what I've gathered, Marcus Freeman's kind of had his hands tied with NIL and things of that nature because of the administration or the fathers, I guess you could say, that are at Notre Dame. But that's an interesting one to talk about and dissect and bring up down the road. So let's talk a little bit about the offensive changes. So the fan base, is this welcomed? Was obviously number one, does the fan base want it? And number two, is it expected with more passing, more of a spread offense, more of a up to date 50% run, 50% pass type of offense for Wisconsin this year?
So let's start with sort of what the fan base thinks. I mean, there is no fan base. I mean, there probably is, but to me, that really, I guess because I get exposed to it a lot, but no fan base that more identified with a style of football versus the results of an offense than Wisconsin and a pro style offense in terms of, you're going to be 2 tight ends. It's going to be a lot of shifts. It's going to be, you're going to stack them in the box and just pile it through. And, the idea back in the day was it negated talent deficiencies on the edge, because you don't need speed at offensive line. You just need strength, and you need technique, and you need development. And then you take a tight end, an inline tight end, and basically make him an extension of that offensive line. You take a fullback and make him an extension of that offensive line, and add another tight end at H. And he's not quite an extension of the offensive line, but he's a big boy who can push. And the idea was just grade it forward, and you can find a way, and you can bust plays if everybody hits their assignment properly and somebody misses a gap on defense, and you give it to a guy like Jonathan Taylor or, Melvin Gordon, and they'll house it. But that really doesn't work anymore, especially because Wisconsin's offense could not find a way to throw. The big sort of second half of Christ's tenure was the fact that they brought in a really highly rated quarterback in Graham Mertz. They had this 4-star kid who was offered by Ohio State, who was offered by these other teams, and they kept him. He never panned out, but they definitely, to use the words you just used, I felt like the hands were tied a little bit after he came in, because there was never a plan B. None of the other quarterbacks, I mean, they had one who just played in the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. They just played against Oklahoma State. Chase Wolf wasn't a Division 1A quarterback. He cannot make those throws, or I'm using an old term, FBS quarterback. But they had other ones behind him who transferred out and were going, FCS. So they never had another option to throw the ball, and they never really had the options at receiver. And then Fickle's hired, and honestly, the big part is Phil Longo was brought in at offensive coordinator, which is, again, I think just as big a story as Fickle. You bring in this, again, best coach in the country, but then you also go out and you get one of the bigger names as an offensive coordinator to come in and totally revolutionize this system. And fans are behind it because right away they brought in 3 4-star quarterbacks in the portal. I mean, you got the starter Tanner Mordecai, you've got Braden Locke behind him, who they pulled from Mississippi State, and then they've got Nick Evers from, where's Nick from? I think it's Oklahoma, who is 3 4-star guys that they've set themselves up for a competition for the next 3 years. And then on top of that, they've got commitments from 2 4-star kids in 24 and 25, which is something Wisconsin never did before. So they're going to change the offense, but they've also walked the walk, because at receiver, they brought CJ Williams from USC, who was a borderline 5-star kid. At wide receiver at Wisconsin, which is a bizarre thing to say, they brought Bryson Green from Oklahoma State, who right now looks like he might be the most polished guy in the wide receiver room. Who are the other ones they brought? They brought in 3. They Will Pauling, slot kid from Cincinnati. So he brought in his best. He picked out of his roster at Cincinnati a little bit, guys that he thought he could slide right in and play. And they're good. Like they brought in talent there. They're gonna have 5 or 6 guys who can rotate at wide receiver. They are gonna throw. I mean, just because of the bodies they brought in. And what's interesting to me is they've had some attrition at tight end, but they haven't really gone out and tried to replace it, which tells you a lot about where the offense is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
They took a walk-on fullback and Riley Nowakowski, shifted him to tight end, gave him a scholarship. He's now presumably the starting tight end, but I think he's going to be a guy who's shifting around a lot behind the line, but he says a lot about body style. He's 6'2" versus a traditional Wisconsin tight end who's going to be 6'5", 6'6", and say 260. If they're an inline guy, he's, I think about 235, 240. So he's a little more mobile, a little bit more like you got to be a pass catching threat. They basically, what they're looking at it as, I don't want a tight end anymore who's just a hat on a hat in a blocking scheme. I need a guy I can put off the line and just take that play. It functionally does the same thing, right? It takes the guy out of the play on defense because they got to put a hat on a hat. But he doesn't need to execute anything for that to happen. He just needs to be out there and be a viable pass catching option. So I definitely think Badger fans are going to see them throw the ball more. And I think they're receptive to it now because they've watched for 5 years a team without an offense that really hums. It really didn't. And there was a need to change things up a bit because it was becoming a hard place to attract talent. I mean, if you look at what they did just by effectively, essentially changing the scheme, they're able to bring kids in that they never would in the past without giving up anything. I mean, they're still humming, at running back. They're not going to take away carries. They're going to take what I hate to use this phrase because everybody's been using it's like been beaten to death, but the offense is going to take what's given to it. Mm-hmm. Longo ran the ball plenty at North Carolina. When he had running backs, he ran the ball plenty. He has 2 running backs on this team. Braylon Allen, I don't think maybe is as good as maybe he gets hyped. He gets a little too much like this, this is the year and then he enters the draft. And I'm like, he's not a top end guy. He is tackle to tackle. He's definitely not sub, 4.5. He's just not that quick, but he's a big dude who can hit. And he's a solid, good contributing piece. And then you've got Ches Malusi, who I think is going to benefit quite a bit from this offense because he's a little more cut and go. He's a little more bursty. I think he's also a guy who can catch the ball. But I think they're going to find ways to give those guys 18, 20 carries a game and probably, less than a half dozen, but maybe 3, 4, 5 touches through the air in a game. So it will be different, but it will also look a lot the same in a lot of ways.
So what's going to be the strength and weakness of Wisconsin football in 2023?
Of all of it, well, I'd say the big question mark for me is probably defensive side. I think the defensive line lost I think the best defensive lineman they've had in a decade in Keanu Benton at nose tackle. He didn't really show against Ohio State, so probably a lot of your listeners didn't really see him because that defense was the whole offense. Ohio State was basically get away from Keanu Benton and you're not going to see him, and it worked because the rest of the team couldn't answer for him. But he was a true nose tackle who took on a double team and just demolished offensive lines all season. And they don't have somebody to replace him. I mean, they have replacement level players, as I like to say, like VORP of 0, if you're going to steal a baseball term, at nose, and Gio Paez, who's a 5th-year guy who can play, but he's rotational. He's not a double teamer. He's not a 2-gap nose. They have decent, a guy from Columbus, actually, a defensive end, Rodis Johnson, who I like, but he just isn't totally consistent. He'll show you burst and he'll show you some things, but then he'll kind of wash a little bit and disappear. But I think he and James Thompson, who's from Cincinnati, are the 1-2 at defensive line. But then behind them, it kind of drops a little bit. And even those guys, I don't think are super top end. They're solid pieces. They're plus pieces, but they're not, great players. So I think what they do at defensive line, how they try to get creative there is going to be a big question, because I think that's maybe where you can push around this defense a little bit, because they are shifting from, they said it was a 3-4, but it was really a 2-4-5. They played the nickel more than anything. And they're shifting into this 3-3-5 that Tressel brings with him, that Mike Tressel, defensive coordinator, brings with him. That
very popular name in these parts.
I mean, this is all like sort of the D'Antonio side of the Ohio State tree.
Yes,
it's really heavy on this team.
It really is. Yeah, the defensive side. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. I mean, there's a lot of fingerprints there. And it'll be interesting to see how they adjust. They have really good linebackers. I mean, they have 3 guys who I think they're not maybe as good as, say, like a Leo Chenal, who we've seen recently, who's now on the Kansas City Chiefs, who was a 2nd-round pick. But they're just a step behind those guys, and there's 3 of them. And watch out for Muma Nongeta and Jake Chaney, who was kind of the 3rd guy at inside linebacker, but I think he's gonna push his way in and compete for time with Jordan Turner. But they have some athleticism there. They have some smart players, who I think are pretty solid. And the secondary is, especially at safety, they're very good at safety. If you want a guy to watch this year for your listeners, Hunter Wohler is going to be a fun player to watch. He was a kid from Wisconsin. He was hurt a little bit played as a true freshman, but got hurt a little bit. And this year, if he stays healthy, I mean, he's a high level safety. The closest I could think of in recent times that they've had would be a guy like Jay Valai, who I was just talking with another friend about, who was a Badger about a decade ago, who was really a fun college player who liked to hit, who could play at the line, who can cover, who has hips, has stuff that you don't see from a lot of Wisconsin safeties. But on the defensive side, it's definitely go after the line of scrimmage. That's going to be where I think they're going to need to come up with some answers. Offensively, it's very hard to say where I think you attack this offense, because it's all new. Like, this is all, we're looking at proof of concept, right? We're looking at, all I've seen now is the prototype. I don't know what it's going to be yet. I think the question on offense is going to be, it's not going to hold the ball as much. There's going to be more 3-and-outs in 57 seconds of game time, because they're going to play fast and they're going to throw the ball. And there's going to be those things that they didn't really have in the past that's going to indirectly test the defense. So I think maybe the trick with the offense is if you can throw it off early and maybe put the defense behind schedule, or I guess you're directly putting the offense behind schedule, indirectly putting the defense behind schedule, and maybe beating them up a little bit early and pushing them on depth. I think that's maybe how you exploit the offense, because I think it's going to score points. They have some explosive players and they have some balance. And the big question, the weakest spot is undoubtedly tight end, but I come back to this isn't your dad's Wisconsin tight end. This is going to be a different offense. They're going to be used differently. So I don't know what my concern level should be if I'm a Badger fan that, they have a converted walk-on and then a couple young guys sort of sprinkled in there. I don't think that that's something that is super high on my list, but I think it's mostly just throw the offensive off early and build a lead. And granted, this offense is better at coming back than past Wisconsin offenses, theoretically, but
that was kind of the running joke was if you could get out on 2 scores on Wisconsin, just sit on it.
Yeah, for sure, because they couldn't adjust. So, right. But I think that's what you do now, just in a different way. They're going to score, but it's at least get ahead a little bit and maybe wipe out their defense early so that you can keep scoring. Because I think the defense will be good. I don't think it's going to be real good like it was, say, 2 years ago, but more in line with what it was last year. I think the defense is still a top 25 defense, somewhere in there. I don't know what the offense is yet, just because it's all conjecture. I think it'll score. I think it has talent, but can it put it all together? I don't know.
Sure. So in your mind, what is the ceiling and what is the floor and what is your prediction?
So let's pull up schedule because I always like to do this off schedule. The non-conference lines up well, theoretically. You've got a Buffalo, Georgia Southern, which are 2 wins. Washington State and Washington, in Pullman is like, they lost to them last year, which was really the harbinger of things.
Yeah, it's the one Pac-12 school that's kind of like still there with Oregon State. Like, anybody want to play?
So it's going to be a weird game. Let's say they can sweep it. I don't know if I'm convinced of that, but let's say they do. You've got Iowa and Madison. You've got Illinois on the road, which is weird to say is a tough game, but I don't know let's see how good they're going to be. They're kind of an unknown at this point. I mean, they lost a lot of guys.
They do, but that defensive line, holy smokes.
Yeah, it's up there.
It is really good.
But if you can work around that, maybe you can generate some points.
Sure.
I am not.
You got to get Illinois going side to side defensively.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Use the whole field, and you're going to create gaps.
I think your ceiling is. I think you're looking at 10-2.
Really?
Yeah.
What if I told you I think you're an 11-1 football team?
I tell you, my name is the Prince of Darkness on our podcast because
you fallen angel, are you? Huh?
Yeah, I am, because I don't think 11. I get it. I mean, maybe he hits the ground running. I think there's a lot of, my bold prediction, we do a bold prediction thing on our show, and I did it back after spring. And my fun one was the Badgers beat Ohio State, but they're going to lose something stupid. It's not what I actually believe, but I know a lot of Ohio State fans are paranoid about that. It's not happening this year. It's not happening. Maybe it will happen, but
I am extremely paranoid about it. I think that, in all honesty, I think the game in Madison might be a more difficult away game for Ohio State than in South Bend, Indiana this year. Which, by the way, take this one to the water cooler for you. First time since the 1800s that Ohio State's playing 6 road games in a year, and 3 of them in the state of Indiana. It's never happened in college football.
It's kind of it's
weird, man.
It's a weird one. It really is. But I don't, what I think a successful season and what I think is a realistic season is just righting the ship a little bit, stabilizing things. They need to beat I know this sounds weird. They need to beat Minnesota. And it was 14 straight years of beating Minnesota. And then Minnesota just RPO'd them to death for the last 3 years and, hit 7-yard slants all day off the RPO and then took it to the house that they just didn't have an answer for. And it was mostly because they couldn't score back. And they got to get back above them. They've got to win convincingly against Iowa. They've got to, that's the stable stuff. They got to stabilize. get back above Illinois, which I think he can do this year. I really do. I mean, he infused a ton of talent in this team, and recruiting wise, they're just doing really simple stuff like recruiting cornerbacks who are taller than 6 feet. I mean, it's kind of bizarre that there's nothing different. These guys, talent profile wise, aren't really any better than what they got in the past. They're now saying, give me the physical athleticism and I'll teach them technique, versus give us technical guys and they'll compensate for being 5'10"
Yeah.
type of thing.
Here's another nugget for you that you can take it to the bank. If Luke Fickle's really high on a 3-star guy, he's really a 4 or 5-star guy. He will develop the heck out of that player. He has done it so many times. That was basically, he went to bat against Urban Meyer when he was the defensive coordinator for some of the 3-star local kids that Urban's like, we ain't taking him. And he's like, no, we need this guy. And Urban's like, no, we can go down to Florida and get a 4-star. And he would say, no, look, Urban, this 3-star kid from Ohio is better than that 4-star kid from Florida. And he would become an all Big Ten, all American linebacker, second round draft pick in the NFL. So when Luke says, when he takes a 3-star kid, especially at linebacker or in the defensive backfield, he's better than that rating. I promise you.
I think that's kind of, in, as I like to say, in the world of Badger fan fiction, what they're hoping for at this point is
take it to the bank, man.
Well, so hopefully, because
on the defensive side, I can't answer to the offensive side because he didn't recruit offensive players when he was at Ohio State. But defensive guys, when he put his signature on someone who was not Ohio State caliber, that kid almost 95% of the time ended up being a starter by year number 3 and an all Big Ten performer.
It'd be interesting to see, because that's really what, we used to say, what holds back Wisconsin from getting to the next level, saying like 2018, 2019, when they were playing New Year's Six Bowls, when they were hitting and they were sort of really hitting on all cylinders there. It was always, they need cornerbacks. I mean, I watched Penn State just throw the ball over them, right? I mean, it was that 2018 in the Big Ten title game. I'm probably getting the year wrong, but it's not important. You just watch it. You have nightmares about sort of these shorter guys just getting outbodied. And if he can do that, I think there is something to be said that it will put Wisconsin in a better position to play against teams that just have a better level of talent than they do, on paper, because what's been happening to them really for the last decade has been, since the last time they beat Ohio State, since 2010, right? My daughter is in high school, and it wasn't even 1 year old when Wisconsin last beat Ohio State, is a way to think of it.
It's been that long, huh?
Yeah. And I mean, you've had,
I was, well, that makes sense. I'm 42 and I was in college and then a new father and starting my adulthood life when Tressel was having all of those amazing battles with Wisconsin. That was our big rival when Tressel was here.
It's funny you say
battles with Wisconsin,
because I knew as soon as there was a certain age. I'm the same age as you. I'm a few years older than you, but every Ohio State fan I talk to who's about my age, because it's dads at soccer games, that's who you end up talking to about this stuff, who are college football fans. And they're like, oh man, I worry about Ohio State. And it's like, guys, you're forgetting the fact that this hasn't happened since 2010. Like, I know you were there when Alvarez was there, but that was because they would do this at the line, and Ohio State adapted. Wisconsin has not. So this is the big test. Like, does the adaptation take, and does it work? And I think we'll see with Longo.
So if you think the ceiling is 10-2, what's the floor?
Like an 8-4. I mean, this is pretty high floor. I think it's an 8-4, 9-3.
So you don't think there's 8-4, 10-2. You think it's going to be just a couple different games difference, really?
I think it's going to be one score stuff that you roll the dice type of thing on a few of them. How do you get to 4 losses? It's tough, but it's like, the offense doesn't gel before Washington State and they lose something ugly like 13-7 or, 20-13 or something like that. And then they lose Ohio State, and then they lose, an Iowa or a Minnesota. And maybe but it's other parts, like, is Nebraska sorted out and resurgent? It's that kind of stuff. You just don't know. Yeah. You don't know.
I think you got to give them a year.
Well, fair enough, but you could make the same argument, I guess, with Wisconsin. But theoretically, I think the roster is better built than
There it is.
Nebraska's.
Yeah, I think Luke Fickle's got a lot more toys to play with in
And he's
Madison than what
been pretty
Rhule's
vocal
got.
about that. I mean, it was interesting to me at media days. He came out and, I know some of it's political because he's very conscious of, I need the buy-in of the fan base. And his first thing is to talk about Barry Alvarez and Paul Christ and, all
Yeah.
these guys who came before me. Brett Bielema. I think he even mentioned Brett Bielema, which was interesting.
Well,
You
he
know,
coached against them a
I,
lot.
I know. And so he's sort of like, I'm taking the reins of these guys. And it's not often that, they cite the coach who was just fired, but he kind of gets like the fan base. It's interesting to me. I don't think Wisconsin fans have a lot of anger or frustration with Paul Chryst. They kind of got, I think for the most part, like the fans that I care engaging with, I guess would be how I'd put it, like kind of all understood, like that guy did something. I mean, he was successful, but he kind of ran out of tricks, and it was time to go. And they handed it off to a new guy who's got new tricks. And it's going to be interesting to see. I think it certainly makes sense to me on paper. And I'm very intrigued to watch it. Like, I think it's going to be a really fun and interesting season, win or lose, just to watch, just to see how this is so different from the Wisconsin that I grew up with,
Yeah.
as a fan.
One more question. Got
Yeah,
a
sure.
fun one. Got a fun one for you. What is the pulse of the fan base when it comes to all of the changes recently with Big Ten expansion, college realignment, 4 Pac-12 schools going to be even further west than Wisconsin now? I mean, it used to be Nebraska was the furthest west, and
Right.
before them it was you guys in Minnesota and Iowa, and now it's way out west. What's the feeling now about that?
So we actually just talked about this on our last show. It's interesting to me because if you go back and you look, who were the two additions, the additions in my lifetime, right? I'm 46 years old. It was Penn State.
Yep.
Right? And
Then
that made
Nebraska.
sense. Penn
Mm-hmm.
State made sense. You're like,
Yep.
okay, Nebraska made sense. They look and act and feel like Big Ten schools. And when they came in, it was, okay, this is, sort of broadening the appeal of the conference. It's teams that very much fit the blueprint. It's traditions. It's this, it's that. It was nothing else than that. And then it really changes, honestly, with Rutgers and Maryland, because the sell on Rutgers and Maryland was TV. And all this stuff now is, and by the way, I'm a guy who lives in Connecticut, so I think it's great they added Rutgers because I get to see a Badger game every 3 years without having to fly, or 2 out of 3 because now they play Maryland enough, so I can take a train to that. Like I like it that way. Do I think it's good for the conference? No, but it's nice just for me as a fan in the New York City metro area. But I think the general reaction has been sort of like, this is just turning into the NFL on Saturdays.
Oh yeah,
And that's all it
absolutely.
is. It's TV product.
Yeah.
And it's being driven. I mean, that's kind of the general consensus. It doesn't make any sense. And it's kind of resignation. Like, we all know it's happening and there's no control over it because it's money, right? And they're all driven by, I mean, this is being driven by people at Fox and ESPN more than anything, who are just saying we need more content. And there's TV executives that say, look how much money we make on NFL. Make your stuff like the NFL. And I think for a lot of us, for me personally, it's not going to make me not watch the Badgers. I'll, of course, watch the Badgers. I'll, of course, watch traditional, like my interest is, the Badgers, Big Ten teams, and then the rest of college football, because I have a context and a flavor. Like, I'll always watch an Ohio State game because there's a context and a flavor. I've seen enough of them in Camp Rattle, or I've seen enough of the Badgers in the Horseshoe to, like, you know what I mean? Like, to have a picture in my mind, just like you do when you say, oh my gosh, it's Barry Alvarez and they're going to grind it and they're going to beat Ohio State this year. Like, there's something that's in you that's been internalized.
That's right.
And
I've had too many bad
Right.
Saturday nights in my life, man.
Well, I go into it just saying, well, I mean, when the last year, I'm like, well, they're not going to win this game. And then 15 minutes in, it's like, oh yeah, they hurt me again. Like, I know what this is. They're going to get run off the field. And so to me, it's kind of like, there's going to be teams that have no context to me. And they're not really Big Ten teams. And it's just going to be building this thing into some sort of weird playoff monolith that isn't fun. Like they're gonna have it's throwing things off without solving anything. Like, what is going to be the purpose of the guaranteed rate bowl in 3 years?
There will be no purpose.
Yeah, and it's not going to exist. Like it has to go away. So they're just creating more chaos.
I do think the bowl system is eventually going to die. It's going to die a long death. I mean, you're going to have to pull the bowls from their dead fingers.
Well, until they don't make money. It's when they stop making money.
I mean, essentially the different rounds are just going to be the different bowls. I mean, I kind of just it may be expanded, but during the regular season, my expectation is going to be that a Purdue game on a Saturday night, Saturday afternoon in Los Angeles against UCLA is going to very much feel like a mid-level bowl game in the middle of the season.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like that.
It's just going to feel odd at first. I don't know that it'll ever truly. I mean, eventually, the younger generation is going to come up and they're just going to be like, "Oh yeah, USC's been in the Big Ten my whole life," and we're going to be like, there was this thing called the Pac-12 many years ago."
Sit down by the rocking chair, young man.
The Pac-12, what is that? Oh, it's kind of like the Big Eight. With the Big Eight, what? There was only 8 teams in a conference. It's going to be very interesting, to see how the different generations accept it. But for us guys who are now middle-aged men, and then of course we heard about all those old timers telling us, the Big 2 and Little 8, and all those stories, and those changed, and it took a while for those to change. It's going to take a while for this to change, but I am excited about some of the new matchups that it creates. Oregon and Ohio State have a very friendly rivalry with one another. We respect one another, even though we've beat the living hell out of them 9 straight times until a couple years ago when we just couldn't stop one play over and over and over again for some reason, which got that guy fired. But what I'm getting at is, like, that's cool. Ohio State and USC have played like it's almost 20 sometimes.
Right.
Most of them in bowl games, most of them back in the 50s and 60s. But that's going to be fun. I'm going to be really intrigued to see where the Big Ten goes from here. Do they go to 20, 24? Do they go south to try to really expand the footprint to where they literally say from north to south, east to west? And they're trying to kind of compete with SEC, which is essentially what we're all seeing. But I explained it on our podcast. This is World War II, and your nations are the television deal. It's the television companies. NBC, Fox, and CBS have all made an alliance with one another, and they're going up against ESPN, ABC, and the pieces, the schools. Those are the pieces on the risk board. That's what they're gathering together, pulling together, to eventually do war with one another. And so, if Fox and CBS and NBC look at the LA market and say we can compete and win with that market, we're going to take it.
Yeah.
Seattle market, we're going to take it. I think the last blue chip outside of the few pieces in the ACC that might eventually disband and get picked up here and there will be Notre Dame. Can they squeeze independence from them some way? But that's neither here nor there. I was just curious to get your feelings. Tell everybody here. Thank you so much again, Rich, for coming on. Tell everybody where they can find BuckAround and find out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you're a podcast person, just whatever you use as podcatching software, just search for BuckAround. You'll find us. Or even simpler, just go to BuckAroundPodcast.com. That just redirects to our link tree, and it's got all our pod feeds. It's got our socials. It's got our contact stuff. Even has our call-in number. So cool. If you want to call and yell at us and tell me what a stupid appearance it was, please do, because I always play those at the end of the pod. But we actually have Paul, a certain fan of our show, Paul from Madison, who calls in regularly, who is just a listener who loves to do a Paul Christ impression and was crushed when Paul Christ was fired, but he just keeps calling in. So he keeps making appearances for those who are curious. But yeah. So if anybody's interested, my pitch always, especially to other fan bases, we are not a homer show. I think we're kind of like, we are consciously aware of our bias, or at least try to be. So we try to be as objective as we can, while at the same time having maybe the depth and breadth of knowledge of someone who is a fan of a team. So I think we're kind of a good balance that way if you're not a Badger fan and you're looking for something else to put in your pod feed. So yeah, go give us a listen. I've got a big mouth and I have a lot to say. And then I have a co-host who's the same way. So you get twice as much of us. So yeah, that's our story. Thanks, Eric. This was fun. I don't get to do these as much. My co-host usually did these, but I don't know. I felt like talking this morning and you got me on vacation. So good move. Good on you, man.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate it. Thank you again so much, man. And good luck this season.
Hey, thanks, man.
Chris, let's jump into the projected starters this year for Wisconsin, starting with the offense first. Now, you mentioned him, and we got done talking about him. Tanner Mordecai comes over from SMU, the gunslinger from down south, is going to be doing the same, I think, for Wisconsin as this offense has obviously changed. Uh, Philosophy from ground and pound to a little bit more of a balanced attack under Luke Fickell. Back at running back is one of, if not the Big Ten's best running back, in my opinion, in Braylon Allen, who is a junior. Again, I know people from Ann Arbor will argue with me and even people from Columbus, but Braylon Allen I think he's more of the total package here. He's the NFL body, and the track record in Wisconsin tells you that Braylon Allen is going to be a good one in the NFL. He'll be running behind an offensive line that is for all purposes one of the younger ones in the Big Ten. A lot of offensive lines in the Big Ten are very senior laden. That is not the case for Wisconsin. Jack Nelson is a redshirt junior. Tanner Bordellini is a redshirt junior. They welcome in transfer Jake Renfro, who's a redshirt junior. Michael Furtney is a redshirt senior, and Riley Malman is a redshirt sophomore. Joe Tippmann was drafted. He's no longer with the team. At tight end, Clay Cundiff is a redshirt senior, so you have a fifth-year senior there at the tight end position. And then catching the ball for Mordecai will be senior Chimeri Dyke. Chimeri Dyke. Shamir. Thank you. Chimeri. Shamir Dyke. I was watching too much Disney, I guess. Will Pauling, redshirt sophomore, is a transfer, and CJ Williams is another sophomore transfer at the wide receiver position. Chris, your thoughts on Wisconsin's offense for 2023?
I think people like you said are going to be used to that ground and pound, and they're still going to see Luke Fickell run the ball. Luke Fickell is going to run the ball. He's got two tremendous running backs with Braylon Allen and you know what? The other kid's name slips my mind, but he was a very good running back last year as well. Their number two guy's pretty tough. Uh, the offensive line, that's going to be your question mark. Like you said, it's a little inexperienced, a little younger. But you know what? If there's one thing that Wisconsin always seems to have, it's a strong offensive line. Luke Fickell knows the importance of winning the battle in the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're going to be just fine. Love Clay Cundiff. I think he's going to be a very good tight end for them this year. We talked about it. Tight end may be very underrated in the Big Ten this year. I think we've got a lot of good ones who are going to develop who maybe don't have the hype right now. I think Cundiff's among those. And Shamir Dyke, another guy who didn't have huge numbers last year, but he was solid. I think he's going to have a great season this year. They've got a new offensive coordinator who likes to air it out. So I'm not saying we're going to go to an air raid type offense, Eric, but what we are going to have is, like you said, balance. And I think that this team has a lot of potential to get out there. And the good thing is they can throw the ball to get up, they can throw the ball to come back, and they have the ability to run the ball to sustain leads and run out the game. This is a very balanced attack.
Very balanced. But here's the thing Wisconsin fans should get themselves ready for: the fact that they will not be so predictable offensively.
Yes.
You could just about mark it down. Wisconsin was going to run on first down, run on second down, and then have to try to throw on third down. That was
Unless
literally
it
their
was less than
offense.
3 yards and they were going to run on third down too.
Exactly. So They are much less predictable offensively, and I think that's going to be a welcome change to the Badger faithful. Flipping over the defensive side of things for Wisconsin at linebacker, um, I don't even know if I want to try. I can't even say Shamir's name right. I imagine I'm
Maybe
not
in Jung Meta.
yeah, sure. Meme Njogmeta, redshirt senior linebacker. Um, let's go back and look at the defensive line first. Sorry. You got Rodus Johnson, redshirt senior. Gio Pays, redshirt senior. Isaiah Mullins, a redshirt senior. Those are your defensive line. So three seniors up front. Canoe Benton it was drafted in the NFL. He was the one defensive lineman who left who went to the NFL. All right, linebackers, Meme Njogmeta is a redshirt senior. C.J. Goats is a redshirt senior. Jordan Turner is a redshirt junior, and Daryl Peterson is a redshirt sophomore. And Nick Herbig, remember that fella?
He was
I don't.
everywhere, man. He was
He was he
defensive
was
end, linebacker, wherever they needed him to go, he went.
yeah. He's doing the same in the NFL these days. Alexander Smith is back, redshirt senior cornerback, and he's joined on the other side by Ricardo Hallman, a redshirt sophomore. At the safety position, you got Kamei Latu, a redshirt senior of Hawaiian descent, obviously. And Hunter Wooler is a junior at safety as well. Transferred in is sophomore kicker Nathaniel Vacos, and Jack Van Dyke is your senior punter. Chris, your thoughts on on the Badger? Almost said Gopher. They would have. Wisconsin fans are going to be mad at me already. If they weren't already, they are now. On your Badger defense.
I think that there's a couple players here on this defense who are going to have to be really big. One of them is Isaiah Mullins. He's really going to have to step into that role, fill in that role that Keanu Benton had last year. He's going to have to, provide some obviously stop the run, but he's also going to have to provide a little pressure from that three-man front. Mema Njogmeta, um, he's got a lot of talent. I feel like this is the guy who's got to step in and be the leader in that linebacker room. You between Benton and Herbig, you lost not only a lot of talent but a lot of leadership. Those two guys to me, Mullins and Njogmeta, are going to have to step up huge in both those capacities. Um, Defensive backs, their defensive backs are pretty much the same as what they were. They got experience. Hopefully, for Wisconsin's sake, they'll maintain at least maintain. But I think how well the defense does comes down to Mullins and Njogmeta. If they succeed, if they excel, this is going to be a very solid defense. If they
I think
don't, I don't think it's going to take Luke Fickell long to make a change.
I think solid is a good description of of this defense. It's solid. It's not game wrecking by any
No,
stretch of the imagination. But when you look at the schedule that they have this season, I don't know that you have to be a bunch of game wreckers. You just
yeah,
need to be solid.
yeah,
Just be
they bought
solid.
the, the schedule makers. I feel like they really, really liked Luke Fickell this year because he only has one cross conference game, obviously against one of the big three,
Uh-huh.
and the West is just so weak. And you've got Iowa coming into your house,
And
so
and for all purposes, your other two crossover games in the East are against the two worst in the East.
yeah,
So, all right, let's take a look at that schedule since you brought it up. So they begin with Buffalo. They go to Washington State in a revenge game, and Georgia Southern, which is not a pushover, but there's no reason why they shouldn't go 3-0 there. They're at Purdue. We don't know. I think that's a Friday night game. We do not know what Purdue is, but I'm pretty sure I know what Wisconsin is. That should be a win. Hopefully, for their sake, they are 4-0 going to a bye week. They then welcome in Rutgers. That should be a win. Then they come up, and this is circle this one. I think this is the game that will decide the West this season between Wisconsin and Iowa. Whoever wins that game more than likely is going to win the West. It's in Madison. I think Wisconsin wins it. At Illinois, again, that's not an easy trip. Illinois stomped you last year. Little different scenario this year though. Now, I like the fact as Ohio State fan, they have to travel to Champaign the week before they play us.
Yeah,
That helps us out because Illinois will beat you up. They are going to be physically beat up. They play Iowa and Illinois in back-to-back weeks, two of the more physical teams in the West before they take on us at Ohio State. Those three games are the three that will make or break their season right there. If they can win the Iowa and Illinois game, it doesn't really matter what happens against Ohio State. They're going to win the West. At Indiana, that should be a W. Against Northwestern, that's a W. Against Nebraska, they get them at home. That should be a W. And then the rival game for Paul Bunyan's Axe at Minnesota to end the year. I think they're a better team than the Gophers. We'll see. I think Minnesota's a pretty good team, but I don't think they're as good as Wisconsin. Vegas says 8.5 wins. I say take the over. I can find 9. I think they're 10-2. Chris, you are really high on Wisconsin. You say 11-1 on the season for the Badgers. Sir, explain yourself.
I think it's simple. I think Luke Fickle is the best coach in the West right now. I think he's brought in enough talent, and he walked into a better situation than Matt Rule did at Nebraska.
Sure.
He already had some talented people in play. He already had decent guys on the offensive line. Like you said, he already had some solid defensive players in play. He's going to make that defense better. He's got the element of surprise, I think, in some cases with that offense. I believe his only loss comes versus Ohio State. And Eric, it's a game that scares me. I'm going to be honest. It's a game that, as an Ohio State fan, scares the snot out of me. I think this is a team and a coach in Luke Fickle that in his first full season is going to be out there competing for a Big Ten title, and don't sleep on them.
Wisconsin Wisconsin scares excuse me. Wisconsin scares me as a Buckeye fan more than Maryland does, simply because we have to go to Camp Randall.
At night.
So, yeah. So that alone is what puts fear in this to me for me. There are 4 really big games on Ohio State's schedule this year, and 3 of them are on the road, and this is one of them. The
Yes.
only one we get at home is against Penn State. Um, Notre Dame, the team up north, Wisconsin, they're all on the road. If Ohio State is going to win the Big Ten and achieve their goals of getting back to Indianapolis and winning a Big Ten championship, they are going to have to be the Road Warriors this year.
Yeah.
Put the shoulder pads with spikes on, paint your faces, you know.
Well, you
Uh,
got the guy there in Columbus who knows how to do it right now.
James Laurinaitis would know. He's got the blueprint for this, guys. You need to be road warriors this season. And I don't know what's a tougher road game. Going to Notre Dame or going to Wisconsin. They're
I
both going to
think
be at night.
I think it's going to Wisconsin, Eric. Fickle, we've talked about it on this show before, Eric. Fickle is going to have vengeance in his heart
The one time he got to play against Ohio State, he came in with a young Cincinnati team.
and was competitive.
No, he got his butt handed to him.
No,
It was a destruction. He didn't
yeah,
even score a point.
I know.
But
And
don't think that that's not motivation for him. It
well, not only
absolutely
that, but
is.
we've talked about it. He didn't even get the phone call, Eric.
Yeah.
And
If you're a Wisconsin fan and you're watching this preview, let me explain what Chris is talking about. When Urban Meyer stepped down, Gene Smith never picked up the phone to dial down to Cincinnati to even offer Luke Fickell, who his dream job was to be an Ohio State head coach, the opportunity to even interview for the position. He never even gave him the respect to even call him to say, "Hey, come up tomorrow, pitch me. We're leaning to Ryan Day. I want to hear from you. See if you can wow me." He never even offered him that opportunity. If he came up and you know what, Gene Smith says, "You know what? We're going with Ryan Day. Ryan blew me away." Okay. But at least you gave him the opportunity. He never even called him.
Well, let me tell you right now. I'm gonna put this out there, Eric. Wisconsin should be very thankful for the coach they got because let me just say, Ryan Day is 45-6. If Fickle would have come to Columbus, he may not have been 45-6, but I guarantee you he wouldn't have been looking at a third straight loss to that team up north either.
Huh? I can't argue that. I mean,
He,
he lost to the team up north in 2011 with a team that had a freshman quarterback that was missing the majority of their stars, who went 6-6 and still almost pulled out that victory
yeah. Well,
in
let me
Ann
tell you,
Arbor.
he had. This is the thing. They've got a coach right now, and granted, the conferences are going away, but this year he's got the opportunity to stick it to the university that passed him over and see the team that he hates most in this conference in the championship game and get them to. Come on, if you're Luke Fickle, this is your dream scenario year right now.
If for some reason Ohio State doesn't make it to the Big Ten championship game, and that stinking team up north does again,
I am.
and
I'll wear
and
Wisconsin red.
Wisconsin is there, you better believe that almost every single person bleeding scarlet, well, they better, all 100% of people who bleed scarlet and gray better become Badger fans that night. Absolutely.
Well, I'll tell you
But
right now.
but then, but then, if he were to win it, what does our podcast? What will the very next thing be on our podcast? What will we be saying, Chris?
Oh, you know what I'll be saying? The same thing.
I
I think it was
know.
Larry Daniels said it. There he is, the one who got away. I'll tell you, Eric.
Woo! We are bringing up some really bad scenarios. We brought up a Maryland
We
scenario that was
but
just crazy to think about, and now we're bringing up a Luke Fickle head coaching scenario that is a nightmare for Ohio State
and
fans.
understand, as much as I have my doubts about Ryan Day right now, my hope is still that Ohio State goes undefeated, goes on to beat that team up north, win a Big Ten title, get a national championship. All I'm saying is, I think that Wisconsin got themselves a great coach who's going to make it very difficult for that to happen.
There is also a scenario where, in your scenario, Chris, where their one loss is to Ohio State
Yes.
and they get a rematch against Ohio State in Indianapolis.
And that concerns me too because let's face it, we all know it's very difficult to be, whether it's basketball, football, whatever. It's very difficult to beat the same team twice in one.
If that were to happen, if Wisconsin were to go to 11-1, their one loss being Ohio State, they then turn around and beat Ohio State for the Big Ten championship, they're going to the CFP in
Oh, without a
Fickle's
doubt,
first year.
without a doubt.
Again, another nightmare scenario for Ohio State fans. This turn this
But
this
then at the same time, I'd almost think, depending on what goes on around the country, we see another year with two Big Ten teams.
probably that would be if Ohio State was 12-1 and their
Yes.
one loss was to Wisconsin. But there's a scenario where Ohio State is 11-1 going into that game, where Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State all defeated each other, and
Yes.
Ohio State gets to go because they had the better non-conference um, opponents record
Hmm.
because of Notre Dame, and then uh,
Does that
and
mean we
then
got to jump on Kennedy's show and cheer for Notre Dame all season?
if I mean if we
Don't tell me I got
lose,
to cheer. Don't tell me I got to cheer for Marcus Freeman.
if Penn State beats Michigan in their house, we beat Penn State in our house, and Michigan beats us in our house, and all three teams are 11-1, I'm pretty sure Ohio State will get to go because of their non-conference record,
Yeah.
because they will have played Notre Dame. I think
Yeah.
there's like if you follow who gets to go on in that scenario, it goes to who had the best non-conference opponent records, and obviously Ohio State's going to win because
Well,
Notre Dame's there.
and we know it's not going to be that team up north because they're playing
They
four high
don't
school teams to.
they don't play anybody. I mean, we know it's not them. So yeah, I mean it's crazy. It's crazy, but Wisconsin brings up these scenarios
And
because it's a very real possibility. And whether it happens
four
this
11 and
year
1
or it
teams.
happens down the road someday,
It's going to
you
happen.
Wisconsin and Ohio State are going to come to a crossroads where Fickle might burn us, man.
So I'm Brandon Jensen, lead betting analyst at Big Banter Sports. Glad to be on the show. So we'll go over to Wisconsin, 8.5, over at -128, under at +104. Tanner Mordecai comes in from SMU, pairing it with Phil Longo's air raid style. I don't think Wisconsin has seen this kind of offense in a while. Returning Braylon Allen and Chaz Malusi in the run game, this is going to be a fantastic unit. Jim Leonard's gone. The defense is not going to be as stout, but I think drawing Ohio State from the East in Madison is going to be a potential game of the year for the season. I think this might be one of my favorite bets. I'm going over. I think Wisconsin flirts with not just 10 wins, I think they flirt with 11, and I think they win the West. I'm a big Fickle guy personally, and I think he does start off running and getting the job done in Madison.
Please like, share, subscribe. We truly do appreciate it. If you are a Wisconsin fan, go ahead, man. Follow us. We're a part of the Big Banter Network, which means we are one of 14 Big Ten podcasts covering all of the 14 Big Ten schools, soon to be 16 starting next year, and maybe more. So go ahead, like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell if you're a Buckeye fan, so you'll be notified every time we drop another show, which is almost daily. We go live every Sunday night at 8 o'clock. Make sure you're there for that. Chris, OH,
I know.
go Bucks.